Good afternoon, everybody, and it's good to be with you again this Thursday as we start another discussion of a psalm. Today I want to look at Psalm 40, and it's a different type of psalm. It's what I would classify as a lament psalm or a sadness psalm. Lament is the idea of being sad, Lament, so a lament psalm, that would be the technical term, or a psalm of sadness. And now Psalm 40 is not as severe as some. Some of these lament psalms, in fact, some of them, there's a special type, they're called imprecatory. They can be very, very, very harsh in their language, in the way that the psalmist asks God for vengeance upon one's enemy or enemies. And so some of this language can be very, very harsh. There's one, I think it's Psalm 144, I believe, where the psalmist asks God to dash the children of his enemies against the rocks, like drop them off a cliff, that kind of idea. So yes, these can be very, very harsh. We are going to look at another lament psalm toward Easter, Psalm 22. It's a lament psalm also, so we'll look at that. But today's is a lament psalm, even though it's not as severe as some. There are elements in it that express, I should say, the sadness that's in the heart of David at this time. So, some characteristics about lament psalms. Now, here's one of the things about lament psalms also I should bring up, is that they are the most numerous in the psalms writings, which you would think would not be so. You think, well, the psalms are all about praising God and joy, and there are several of them that echo that kind of sentiment, no doubt about it. But there are more psalms that express sadness than anything else. And so I'll come back to that in just a minute. But here's some of the elements that you're going to be looking for when you think about a lament type of psalm. So these elements will be there, most of them. They may not always be there, all of them in each lament psalm, but the majority of these elements will be within one of these kinds of psalms. So one of the first things that's going to happen is there's going to be some kind of a plea to God. So the psalmist is reaching out, making a plea to God, pleading his behalf toward God. And that plea is asking, not only is it, first it's telling the situation, circumstance that's going on, but also it's asking for God's help. So there's a plea going on for God's help. There's going to be something about some complaints being offered about the psalmist's oppressors or adversaries. Oftentimes they'll be called enemies, but don't think so strictly as that. Just think adversaries. So there's going to be some kind of a complaint offered. There's generally a confession of sin or some kind of a claim of innocence in regard to the oppressors accusing. So there could be sin. That's been part of the problem. That may be one of the reasons why the person is being accused by adversaries, or it could just be that they're lying about it and that the psalmist is making a claim of innocence within this type of psalm. There's going to be some kind of an assurance of God's help and intervention. The psalmist is confident that God is going to do something, and then it always closes with some kind of praise towards God. So it starts off very gloomy and doomy, and then at the end, it moves to more of a rosy outlook. So most of these psalms, these lament psalms, will have these kind of elements within them. Now, some aids to understanding the psalms before we jump into this and start talking about it a little bit more. Some things that would be very, very helpful for you if you're trying to understand what's going on in the psalms. Any historical writings within the Old Testament are going to be very, very helpful for you. So you can go back and read Genesis, Exodus would be helpful. All of those, any place where there's historical information being presented, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. You could look at, Ruth probably won't help you very much, but it is a narrative style writing. Esther's not going to help you very much either, even though it is a narrative style writing. Most of it's going to be history around the monarchy, or what's leading to the monarchy, or the early origins of the Hebrew people. If you knew that history very, very well, it is going to help you tremendously in understanding some of the historical information that's being shared. Probably some cultural information also. Now, just because we're getting a lot of our information from the Bible, it doesn't mean the Bible has all of the historical information. It would be wise for you to expand your study into other areas so that you could find out more about this area it's called the ancient Near East, and you can find out more of things going on at this time throughout this period of history in the Old Testament. And another thing that would be very helpful is a book authored by Tremper. His name is Tremper Longman III. Tremper Longman III. And he wrote a book called How to Read the Psalms. It's very, very helpful. It's not a very long book. I think it's only about 110, maybe 120 pages. Very readable. It's really kind of set up to be more for like Sunday school studies. So this would be a very good resource for you to have also. So those are some of the things to understand about trying to understand the Psalms anyway. All right, lament Psalms. Now, why would there be so many lament Psalms within the Psalms writings? That's a good question. Well, just think about life. Life is hard. So even in the Old Covenant members had difficulties. We would expect that. We know the New Testament. When we get the New Testament, Jesus warned us that we're going to have trouble. So Christians know there's difficulty that's going to come in their life at some point. And what we learn from things like this is no matter what covenant you're in, Old Covenant or New Covenant, that people act the same way or should act the same way when difficulties arise. They should go straight to the Lord. They should seek the Lord and His help. And so that's what we learn from this. And we need to try not to take matters into our own hands as far as reference of retribution or justice. That's just not what we're supposed to do. We are supposed to trust in the Lord, and the Psalms teach us that, and it's echoed also in the New Testament, especially in Romans 12 and the Beatitude or the Sermon on the Mount, and in so many other places about how we're supposed to conduct ourselves in these difficult situations when we face these adversaries, and how we're supposed to lean on the Lord through these things. We need to let God take care of the situation. That's what we need to do. We need to be prayer warriors. That's what the Psalms teach us so many times. Okay, let's begin looking at this Psalm real quick. So, if you look at verses, I'm going to kind of group it together. So, I want to look at verses 1 through 3 quickly, and then we'll kind of go through more of it. But they kind of are lumped together. They're sectioned off in our translations very, very well as far as like separating out these verses that seem to go together. But anyway, if you look at verse 1, this is an announcement about somebody wanting something from God. It seems like the person is praying. It talks about being Lord listening, inclined to hearing, meaning like he's pointing his ear that way. That's the idea. And so the person is praying or seeking God's help, pleading with God anyway. And there are positive benefits from this, is what he begins to say. If you think about David, again, if you knew David's history, it would be very, very helpful. Though Psalm 40, there's no way for us to know for sure what time period of David's life it would fit into. It's just not possible for us to know. But it does seem to fit into a general tenor of David's difficulties at times. But anyway, he's pleading for God. He's asking God to get rid of his despair and all this detrimental activity that's coming against him. So he's asking for God's intervention and for His aid in some kind of situation. So God, he says, is going to take him out of this horrible situation. In verse 2, the pit of destruction and the miry bog. These are all images of being like stuck in something that you don't want to be stuck in. God is going to pull him out of there, and He's going to set him on a secure place, on a rock, and where his steps are secure, is what he says. So there's physical aid that God provides David. And so He pulls him out of this and puts him back on the right path. And so that kind of idea comes up. He also changes his disposition. You look in verse 3. So even though it's going to become dark later on, this psalm projects this praise to God, or this ability that God has to change our disposition. And so he talks about putting a song in the mouth of David, or a song of praise, as he sings praises to God And these actions are going to have an effect upon others. So even though David's going through these horrible situations, difficulties, he asks God to help. God does something beneficial for him. It has some kind of effect upon other people as far as them seeing what's going on, and it has a positive effect upon their relationship with the Lord also. They, in verse 3, put their trust in the Lord also. We talked about this last week, but our behaviors do have a reflection upon God for sure. If we're positive about God, it's going to be seen by others. If we're negative about God, it's going to be seen by others. If we're positive about the church, it's going to resonate with others. If we're negative about the church, it's going to resonate with others. How we project God and the church, Christ to others really, really matters. And so when we evangelize, we have to evangelize with a joyful disposition that arises from our relationship with the Lord. Not a fake joy, a real joy, a true joy. Even though we're going through difficulties, we know the Lord is right there with us. Well, if you look at verses 4 and 5, here's where we have our blessings that come in. So there's benefits for the person who seeks the Lord's guidance in all that he does. And so these blessings occur, and there's a direct a lifestyle contrast, I guess, presented here between the person who's dependent upon God and then with the person who's dependent upon a sinful, arrogant person. Where are you going to seek your counsel? Are you going to seek it from God? Are you going to try to find your help and your aid from God? Or are you going to go to those people who are arrogant and not truthful? They're going to steer you down the wrong path. That kind of idea. There's a contrast being presented here, is what he says. And David says it's the man or the person who trusts in the Lord and seeks the Lord's guidance and follows the Lord's lead is going to be the one who's going to be blessed. Verse 5, he just talks about the abundance of blessing in his life. Over and over, God has blessed him. I find it interesting he uses the word multiplied in verse 5. There's not an idea of multiplication in Hebrew. So they didn't even have that kind of idea in Hebrew itself. So it's probably not a good idea to use multiplied here, even though I think it is conveying the sense. But the idea is that he is making whatever blessings that have been given, that they are they're growing bigger and bigger all the time. That's the idea. So it is the idea of multiplication, but that's not the way that it's the increase is coming. The increase is becoming from God's goodness. Let's put it this way. So God's goodness has been very abundant in this person's life, David's life. And so he talks about it. And he talks about, in verse 5, about these wondrous deeds. And then I like the next part too, where he talks about thoughts towards us. So not only is God acting and doing great things for us in our lives, but his mind. He thinks that there's a mental connection there also. You could talk about the very idea of we are always on his mind. That kind of idea. That's what the psalmist says. Not only is his activity present in our life, but we are always on his mind. He's always thinking about that. God's always thinking about us, anyway. And he says there's no one that can compare with the Lord. Now, again, David lives in a world, and David probably would have thought this way also, that there are other gods out there. But he says there's no one else like God. This is echoed throughout the Old Testament also, because of the belief system of an array of gods but the Israelite people always maintained, the Scripture always maintained, that there is no other God like Yahweh. And it's true, there is no other God like Yahweh. And David's going to tell others about all these beautiful blessings that God has given in his life, received blessings anyway. So there's an amount of abundance that is occurring, abundance of good things coming from God into David's life. Verses 6 through 8, it's kind of interesting here because he talks about the sacrifices and the offerings. In fact, when I look at this, about the sacrifices and the offerings you've not delighted, and about doing the will of the Lord and so many other things, there are many things that come to mind. I think about Jesus. He talks about this too, and this is echoed in Hosea where he says, "A sacrifice and burnt offering is not what I desired, but a clean and pure heart," or something like that in Hosea. And then, but this is echoed again, the idea of that God really wanted a relationship with the people. That's what we have here. We have a contrast in verses 6 and 7 and 8. David is presenting a contrast between people who practice ritualistic practices, and they think that's their way of relating to God, whereas people who have a genuine, sincere relationship with the Lord. And in verses 6, 7, and 8, it seems like the Lord is really looking for the relational things. Even though you would say, well, we're in the Old Covenant. Verse 8, it talks about the Old Covenant, the word law. That's the word for Torah, or for the Old Covenant. Sacrifices and offerings were part of that Old Covenant agreement, right? And I would say, yes, they were, definitely. But these are rituals that you go through. What the Lord really wanted was to have that relationship. In fact, Jesus says it very clearly when asked, what are the two greatest commandments? Well, the first is love God with everything you have. It's not make sure you perform all your offerings and burnt offerings on time and with the right attitude. That's not what Jesus says. He says the first thing is love God with everything you have. God wanted a relationship, and that's what we have here. And so a couple of weeks ago I talked to you about how the king was supposed to be the one who the law was read to, the one who practiced it better than anyone else, the one who enforced it, the one who guided other people towards it and stuff like that. Well, that's what we have being said here. It was the king who was the one who was to be the proclaimer of the law, the practitioner of the law, help others, encourage them to follow the law, enforce the law, all this stuff. And so it was very, very important that the king had knew the Old Covenant, those guidelines very, very well, and practiced them in his own life. So he's talking about this here. He says these are the things that that you don't really, that aren't a great concern for you, but this other part is to do your will. To do your will. Interesting, he talks about doing your will. Now, what would that will be? Obviously, it's going to have to be connected to whatever is in the Torah. Because verse 8, it kind of goes together. He says, I want to do your will. Then he goes, but your Torah is within my heart. Meaning that he can find what the will of the Lord is by just knowing from his heart what the Torah teaches. And the Torah teaches to have a loyal, loving relationship with the Lord. That is the will of God. Now, before I go on to verse 9, I do want to bring up something from the New Testament real quickly. When I was looking at this, I was automatically drawn to, these verses right here, I should say. I was automatically drawn to John chapter 4 when Jesus is talking to the Canaanite woman at the well, Samaritan woman at the well. And they're talking about where it is you're supposed to worship. And she asks him, are we supposed to go worship on Mount Eleazar? Are we supposed to go down to worship, Gerizim, Mount Gerizim? Are we supposed to go down to Jerusalem to worship? And Jesus says, neither. He says, not a place. He just says, comes a time, this is John chapter 4, verse 23, He says, there comes a time when true worshipers, that's what he says, true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And so I think that resonates kind of, and I don't want to read back, but I do think this idea from the Psalms, we could read it forward into the New Testament. Yes, we have ritualistic practices that are going on in the Old Covenant. There's no doubt about it. God gave them certain practices that they needed to do on a regular basis. There was rituals that they needed to practice. But those rituals were only there in order to help you understand why you needed this deep and loving and loyal relationship with the Lord. They were to help you. But sadly, so many people started to see the rituals as their relationship instead of understanding that the rituals were a means to help them to have a better relationship. I hope you can understand the idea, the difference I'm trying to project here. God wants to have a relationship with you. He wants to talk with you. He wants to spend time with you. Do that with him. Now, verses 9 and 10. Again, he talks about he's going to tell people about what's going on. There's this continual thankfulness. And verse 9, I wish in the ESV it says in the great congregation. I wish they wouldn't use congregation, that kind of language, because it confuses people. This is not church. This is not a church environment. He's just talking about the assembly of people. And so when people are assembled, he's going to tell people about what God has done for him. Now, we are dealing with all people in the Old Covenant. We're not dealing with people outside of the Old Covenant. I'm going to talk about that more when we get down to the part where he talks about his adversary. But David is going to tell everybody about what God has done in his life. He's going to let them know. And verse 10 is just so wonderful because it uses all these wonderful, or gives us all these wonderful attributes about God. It talks about the faithfulness of God. It talks about his rescue. Let me talk about rescue. In verse 10, it talks about salvation. This is not the idea of Christian salvation or everlasting salvation that we would understand from the New Covenant. It has nothing to do with that. He's actually talking about physical deliverance. So David expects God to pull him out of this difficult situation, rescue him from this. He was talking about being in a pit of destruction in verse 1 and then being in a bog. I think it was verse 1 or verse 2. Talking about being stuck in this place of this. It's a dismal place and a place of despair. But anyway, God is going to pull him out of there. So he's not talking about what we would think about, as far as I would say, Christian salvation. But he's talking about deliverance. But anyway, we have that. God's ability to deliver, rescue people. God's steadfast love. That's that word hesed there that shows up all over the Old Testament. That's so very important. Here's what's so interesting about steadfast love. I talked to you about all its various meanings. This is the thing about the word hesed. No other being in the Bible is able to act out with hesed except God. No human can do this. It's never attributed to a human. This type of action, hesed, or chesed, probably a person with Hebrew, a greater appreciation of Hebrew, probably try to get that cuss sound in there, because it does have that in there. It's hard for me to do it. But anyway, it's never attributed to anyone else except to God. And then also he talks about faithfulness again. Now it's a different word. It's not a completely different word. It's used in verse, they're both in verse 10. Now the words are very, very similar. In fact, they're cognates of one another. And so there's a similarity of words there also. But anyway, we have this idea of faithfulness, God's ability to rescue, and his loyal, lasting, loving, steadfast love for us, covenantal love. And so these are all the attributes he talks about. He's going to tell other people about these things. He's not going to shut it within himself and not tell anyone. He's not going to be quiet about it. He is going to choose to talk about God's goodness in his life. Verse 11 and verse 12, we begin to start to see a confession of sins. So in fact, in verse 12, he talks about this idea of these sins. Verse 11 kind of echoes what was said before, but the reason why he starts off this way, I think, in verse 11 about God's mercy, his steadfast love, his faithfulness being preserved, is because of what he knows about God. So David expects this because this is the way God is. And so he expects these things. He expects God's mercy in his life. And he expects these things to happen, even though he is a sinner. Look at verse 12. He started off before talking about God's mercy and all these other things before he began to expound upon his sins. Now in verse 12 we find out sins are a problem in his life. Very, very, a lot of sins. He says, they've overtaken me and he cannot see. It's the idea of standing and he's being covered with these sins and he can't see. It's blocked his vision, that kind of idea. So he just has it all around him. He has evil all around him. It's not a good situation. And he needs rescue. And so something's happened and David's made a bad choice. He's sinful. But we're all sinful. At least he recognizes it. But what's so interesting about David is that he knows where to seek help. He goes to the Lord always. David makes mistakes. True. But David always goes to the Lord after his mistake. You know, that's the thing about it. Christians are going to make mistakes. So that doesn't bother me that Christians make mistakes, because everybody's going to make a mistake. What bothers me is what happens afterward. I would advise people, go straight to the Lord. Go straight to the Lord. Don't worry about your mistake. Go straight to the Lord, just like what David did. Other people just don't think it's very, very important, and they just, let it slide. I think we need to admit our faults to the Lord, even though He knows them, and just have that soothing time of communication, community with God when these things are going on. David did, and I think it'd be good for us to do also. Now, if we go on in verses 13 and 14, now we start to see that he has some kind of adversary in his life. He doesn't say anything about who it is. He doesn't give us any kind of historical details that could help us out. But he does talk about these people that he wants me to put to shame. He wants them to be disappointed. He wants them to be brought to dishonor. And so these are his adversaries. Verse 13, he's asking God to deliver him from his adversary or adversaries. We don't know. Now here's one of the interesting things about this. These type of psalms, there's always going to be a complaint given against an adversary or adversaries. It could be enemies in your language, the language that whatever translation you're looking at. They could have used that in their translation. It could be the language they use. But anyway, you have this proclamation about enemies or adversaries and what they're doing, and then there's an ask, a pleading from the person, a request from the person for God to do something that would be some kind of retribution, some kind of justice be in their life. And sometimes it can be very, very severe. Now here it's not very severe. It's only that shame be brought to this person. And here's another thing I want to talk about these adversaries. We're dealing with the Old Covenant. We're dealing with a small, small nation of Israel. Everybody in that covenant was an Israelite. All the Old Covenant people were Israelite people. So when he's talking about his enemies, he's talking about someone within his adversary, he's talking about someone within the nation of Israel. Did David have enemies outside of the nation of Israel? Well, yeah, there were the Philistines, and the Egyptians were probably hounding them every now and then. There were some kingdoms to the north that were kind of coming to their end at this time, but the Hittite Empire was there. The Assyrians are starting to come around. My point being is there were enemies around. There were. But David never mentions those as far as being the people he's talking about in the Psalms. He just talks about adversaries. And we know if we look at David's life that he had adversaries for sure. And so it's probably just better for us to understand that he's talking about adversaries or oppressors that are within the Old Covenant itself. Even though people are in the covenant, doesn't mean they're living by the covenant. And I think that's a good principle we need to understand in the New Testament too. Even though people say they're in the New Covenant, doesn't mean that they're living by the Old Covenant. And so we've got to discern people. We've got to be fruit inspectors, like Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7. But anyway, he asks for God's intervention here and for this dishonor and shame to be brought upon these people. So this is where these kind of psalms get to be a little bit difficult for us to appreciate, I guess. But again, as I said before, all people that have ever lived have had difficulties in their life. And you will have difficulties in your life in this world. And what we find out is that the Lord is always there to help us. Sin has created this situation for us. But God is there to help us out through all things. Verses 16 and 17 comes back to this praise of God. It always ends up, these type of psalms always end up on a positive note. Even though they work towards a very gloomy picture at points within the psalm, they'll always end up on a positive note. And here we talk about positive information coming out in verses 16 and 17. Everybody who seeks the Lord is going to find joy and going to be glad, and they are going to have rescue from whatever situation that's going on. And from that, they're going to have a great testimony about the wonders and the appreciation and the thankfulness they have for God's deliverance. Verse 17, he talks about himself being poor and needy, meaning that he has the right disposition. Now he's saying this, and he is the king probably at this time. He's saying he's poor and needy, but he's just talking about his disposition in relation to God. He needs the Lord. He's the one that needs these things, and the Lord will provide for him because the Lord is inclined to him. And again, the Lord is going to deliver him and help him out in all these situations. Wonderful, wonderful psalm for sure. Now I want to talk about one thing that I think carries over into the New Testament just real quickly, just a couple minutes, real fast. As I said, we are going to have difficulties in this world. And as Christians, Jesus warned us that it will be hard. So what are we supposed to do? I think the best advice for us comes out of Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 through 7. I'd urge you to read that portion of Philippians. But in that text, Paul teaches us about letting God know your difficulties. He talks about praying. Don't stop praying. Pray. Give this information to God. Let him work in your life. Trust in God's help. Do not be anxious about anything, is what he says. But by prayer and supplication and thanksgiving, offer all these things up to God, and God will deliver you according to his time. We have to trust in the Lord. So we cast all of our difficulties, as David did, the psalmist, upon God. We can express our anger. We can express our fear. We can express our joy, obviously. But we can lay all this out before God and trust that he is going to provide the best thing for us. And when we do, your peace with God will be known. But also as Christians, we know ultimately we know our peace with God is secure in Christ. All right, I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday, and I will see you on Sunday. Take care. Bye.